Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are jumping into a really cool area of psychology.
Yeah, we're looking at all the different frameworks people have developed over the years.
Exactly, trying to figure out why we humans do what we do.
hmm
How our minds work, personality, what makes us tick.
It's kind of like having a toolkit, isn't it? Filled with these unique lenses.
Lenses, that's a good way to put it.
And you can look at the same situation, maybe, say, a team struggling at work through all these different lenses.
And each one shows you something different.
Something completely different, but maybe equally important for understanding the whole picture.
Absolutely. And our guide for this exploration, our source material, is a chapter by Zielberg,
Right. It's called Frameworks for Thought and Practice in IO Psychology.
IO being industrial organizational psychology.
And the source does a really good job, I think, of laying out the history of these major schools of thought.
And connecting them back to the workplace, which is key.
That's the mission, really. How do these historical ideas help us understand people and organizations today?
So our goal here is to pull out the core ideas, the useful bits from these different schools.
From the really foundational ones right up to more recent perspectives.
And see how they offer you, our listener, different ways to have those aha moments about behavior, your own, your colleagues, maybe even your whole company's culture.
Yeah, this isn't just, dry academic history. These frameworks can genuinely shift how you see things.
Okay, so where do we start? The source begins by setting the groundwork, right? Talking about paradigms and theories.
Yeah, let's define those terms first. What's a paradigm in this context?
Well, think of it as the really big picture, a whole school of thought. It's like the fundamental way you even approach studying the mind.
A basic pattern or model for thinking.
Exactly. And then within that paradigm, you have an epistemology.
Which is about how you know things within that framework, what counts as valid knowledge.
Yeah, if the paradigm is the house style, epistemology is how you decide what furniture fits, kind of.
And what's fascinating is how these different paradigms can look at the exact same thing, say, aggression,
Right.
and come up with totally different reasons for it.
One might say it's learned behavior, maybe rewarded somehow.
Another might point to unconscious anger, maybe from childhood.
Or maybe cultural influences.
Or even from a humanistic view, maybe feeling like their potential isn't being recognized. Different lenses, different explanations.
So a psychological theory is usually more specific or operating within one of those broader paradigms.
Yeah, it's a particular framework trying to explain or predict behavior, often based on assumptions researchers tried to test empirically.
Though the source notes, some theories have more evidence than others.
Definitely. And it mentions how psychology as a science really took off in the late 1800s.
Influenced by things like physics and the Industrial Revolution.
It started quite mechanically, didn't it? Looking at basic conscious stuff like attention reaction times.
Yeah, breaking it down. And IO psychology basically takes these foundational ideas.
And applies them in the workplace, while also developing its own work-specific theories, of course.
So understanding these broad frameworks is really the foundation for IO practice.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's rewind. The source takes us back to the very beginning, structuralism and functionalism.
Structuralism. The first big school, late 1800s, Wundt, Titchener.
Their main question was, what is the structure of the mind? What are its basic building blocks?
Like taking apart a clock to see how it works.
Exactly. Trying to break consciousness down into its simplest bits, sensations, feelings, images.
And their method was analytical introspection.
Right. Training people to report their immediate raw experience.
Like describing the sensation of seeing red, not just saying red.
Which sounds incredibly difficult and subjective.
It was. That was the big criticism. Hard to verify, hard to compare results. Plus, they assumed everyone's mind was built the same way.
Which seems unlikely.
But their big contribution was establishing psychology as a science.
Systematic methods, experiments, that was huge.
And introspection, in a less rigid way, is still used. Think employee surveys asking about feelings or experiences.
Good point. Self-reports are still a thing. Okay, so then came functionalism.
Influenced by Darwin and evolution.
So the question shifted from what is the mind to what does it do?
Right. How does it help us adapt, survive, function in our environment?
Francis Galton was key here, studying individual differences.
Why people vary in abilities, intelligence. He started developing tests, questionnaires, using statistics.
And those methods testing stats, individual differences are the bread and butter of IO psychology today, aren't they?
Absolutely. using assessments to predict job performance, for example.
So functionalism broadened the scope, child psychology, mental testing, motivation, all about how the mind functions.
It wasn't perfect, maybe missed some dynamics, but its practical focus lives on.
Especially in applied fields like IO, that pragmatic approach is still very visible.
Okay, let's move on to some of the real heavy hitters of the 20th century. Behaviorism first.
Yeah, often called the first force. This started early 1900s, really pushing back against introspection.
Watson, Skinner.
Yeah.
Their idea was, forget the mind, it's a black box. Let's just study observable behavior.
Stimulus response. SR psychology, what goes in and what comes out.
They believed behavior is learned, shaped by the environment. Very deterministic.
Watson's famous claim about raising any baby to be anything.
Right, just by controlling the environment.
The core mechanism was conditioning, learning through association.
Like Pavlov's dogs, or touching a hot stove and pulling your hand back.
Yeah.
Simple stimulus, simple response.
And Skinner added operant conditioning, learning through consequences.
Rewards reinforce behavior, punishments decrease it. The law of effect.
But behaviorism didn't stay static, did it?
No, later versions, neo-behaviorism, social cognitive theory brought thinking back in.
The O and SOR, the organism, what happens inside matters too.
People like Bandura, you talked about observational learning.
Right. We learn just by watching others. Our expectations, beliefs, memories, they all play a role.
And his concept of self-efficacy.
Huge. That belief in your own ability to succeed. Massively important in coaching, career development, therapy.
So from this viewpoint, personality is basically a collection of learned behaviors and habits.
Shaped by your environment and learning history, individual differences come from different experiences.
And the applications are everywhere. Training programs, performance management.
Reward systems, advertising, therapy techniques, behaviorist principles are deeply embedded.
Okay, shifting gears dramatically. Psychoanalysis, Freud.
The second force. Starting a bit earlier, really, late 1800s. This one dives deep into the unconscious.
Freud's big idea was that most of what drives us is hidden, below the surface.
Unconscious desires, fears, repressed memories, especially from early childhood. He thought these determined our behavior without us even realizing it.
Energy coming from basic drives, instincts, life and death instincts, eros and thanatos.
Right. And unacceptable thoughts or traumas get pushed down, repressed, but still influence us.
Like maybe adult issues with authority, stemming from unresolved childhood conflicts.
That's the kind of connection psychoanalysis looks for. And the technique was free association.
Just talking freely, hoping to uncover those hidden conflicts, bring them to light.
Freud saw people as often caught in these internal battles, controlled by unconscious forces.
And he described defense mechanisms, the ego's way of protecting itself from anxiety.
Repression, projection, rationalization. The source lists quite a few.
You see them all the time, making excuses for messing up rationalization.
Or accusing your partner of being angry when you're the one who's annoyed, projection.
His model of the mind was like an iceberg, right?
Exactly. Conscious mind is just the tip, preconscious just below, and the vast unconscious underneath.
Holding the primitive drives, wanting immediate pleasure.
Then the ego, the conscious part, trying to deal with reality, immediate conflicts.
And the superego, our internalized conscience, morals, social rules.
The source gives that workplace example. Employee wants leave for fun. I. Manager says no due to schedules. Ugo. Company policy is the backdrop. Superego.
And the employee calling in sick shows the ego struggling with that conflict.
So personality, for Freud, is shaped by these structures and early experiences. Maladjustment comes from unresolved conflicts.
It's criticized for being hard to test scientifically. Very subjective.
True. But proponents argue its value in clinical settings for understanding deep-seated issues. And some IO folks look at unconscious team dynamics.
Jung branched off too, right? Less focus on sex, more on the collective unconscious archetypes.
Yes, still psychodynamic, but a different flavor.
Okay, then came the third force, humanism. Rogers, Maslow, mid-20th century.
And this was a reaction against the determinism of the first two forces, much more optimistic.
Seeing humans as inherently good, with free will, potential for growth.
Focusing on the positive conscious aspects. Holism, seeing the whole person. Subjective experience being key.
Rogers and the self-concept, how you see yourself. And that innate drive to grow, the actualizing tendency.
And Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs leading up to self-actualization, that drive to fulfill your potential.
They talked about the fully functioning person, open, creative, self-accepting.
Maladjustment from this view happens when that growth is blocked. Maybe basic needs aren't met or you don't get unconditional acceptance from others.
And in the workplace,
Huge impact on the human relations movement. Treating employees as people, not just resources.
recognizing needs for growth, recognition, good relationships, still very relevant for motivation, leadership.
Criticized for being maybe too optimistic or subjective, but its positive focus was vital and it paved the way for positive psychology later.
Let's quickly touch on Gestalt psychology, too.
Right, emerged in Europe, also reacting against breaking things down. Gestalt means whole or pattern,
Their famous saying, the whole is more than the sum of its parts.
like seeing moving pictures from flashing lights or recognizing a melody, not just individual notes. The mind organizes experience into meaningful wholes.
So they studied the whole conscious experience, not just elements.
Exactly. They didn't have a specific personality theory, but the idea of holism influenced many others.
And in I.O., it helps understand group phenomena, right?
Yeah, like team morale or organizational culture. It's not just individual opinions added up, it's the collective feeling, the overall pattern or gestalt.
Okay, moving towards more contemporary views, cognitive psychology.
This really took off from the 1950s, pushing back hard against pure behaviorism. It brought the mind, cognition back.
Thinking, memory, problem-solving, language, all those higher mental processes.
Kind of like viewing the mind as an information processor, input, process, output.
How we form mental constructs or schemas, those frameworks we use to understand the world.
They help us make meaning, interpret things, predict what might happen.
George Kelly's personality theory fits here, personality as a system of personal constructs.
Right. How we interpret our experiences shapes who we are, and we can change by changing those interpretations.
Like during organizational change, people have to adapt their mental models of how things work.
If they can't or won't, it leads to stress. Think about adapting to remote work during the pandemic, a massive shift in constructs.
Cognitive psychology applications are everywhere now.
Learning styles, decision-making, therapy, and seeing organizations as information processing systems is a very cognitive view used in I.O.
Next up, biological and evolutionary perspectives.
Biological psychology, or neuroscience, looks at the direct link between biology, genes, brain activity, hormones, and our behavior, thoughts, feelings.
The mind-body connection, how physical states affect psychology and vice versa.
Evolutionary psychology is a specific application of this. It asks how certain psychological traits or behaviors might have evolved because they helped our ancestors survive and reproduce.
Natural selection applied to the mind.
Pretty much. So from this perspective, personality has biological roots. Think temperament being partly genetic. Trait theories often connect back to biology, too.
Applications in I.O. might be less direct day-to-day, but understanding biological factors in stress or temperament can be useful.
Definitely. Okay, a much more recent one, positive psychology.
This one really gained traction around the year 2000. Seligman is a key name.
And the big shift was from focusing on illness and problems to focusing on well-being, happiness, strengths, flourishing, what makes life good.
So instead of just fixing what's broken, it's about building what's strong.
Exactly. Studying things like optimism, resilience, gratitude, courage. It builds on humanism's positive view, but aims for more empirical rigor.
The source points out psychology wasn't all negative before.
True. Things like training or job satisfaction always had positive aims. But positive psychology made studying positive states and strengths a central focus.
What kind of things do they study specifically?
Positive emotions, positive traits or virtues, and the institutions that foster them. They look at different types of happiness, pleasure, engagement or flow, and meaning or purpose.
It's not a separate personality theory, but it identifies traits linked to well-being.
And explores how to cultivate them. This had a huge influence in I.O. employee engagement, strengths-based development, positive leadership, creating thriving workplaces.
Finally, in this cluster, traits psychology.
Also called the psychometric approach. This focuses on identifying and measuring stable, enduring patterns of behavior traits.
Like introversion, extroversion, conscientiousness.
Exactly. The idea is that people have these underlying dispositions that make them behave somewhat consistently across situations. They see a strong biological basis for many traits.
Key figures like Allport, Cattell, Eysenck, and the developers of the Big Five model.
Right, the five-factor model. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Or its opposite, emotional stability. That's become a dominant framework.
And the main contribution seems to be measurement, assessment.
Definitely. Developing reliable questionnaires to measure these traits and other individual differences, that's fundamental to psychological testing.
And crucial for I/O in areas like selection, team building, career counseling.
Hugely important. Research shows traits like conscientiousness predict job performance quite well. Critics say it describes personality well, but doesn't explain how it develops or the dynamics as much.
Okay, now a really important shift in focus. The source emphasizes context, sociocultural, African, Eastern, and ecosystemic views.
Yes, this is critical. All the previous views tended to focus more internally. These remind us behavior is embedded in a social and cultural world.
The sociocultural approach looks at how society, family, peers, education, media, and especially culture shape us.
Culture being that whole system of shared knowledge, values, beliefs, norms, it influences everything. The source really stresses you can't just take a theory developed in one culture and assume it works everywhere else.
Context matters.
Hugely. And the idea that humans are social beings is central here too.
The Hawthorne studies are a classic example in the workplace, aren't they?
Yeah.
Social factors mattering more than just physical conditions.
Exactly. And since the mid-20th century, there's been growing recognition of culture's pervasive influence.
This is vital in I/O, particularly with diverse workforces.
Absolutely. Understanding cultural differences, like individualism versus collectivism, is key for communication, management, avoiding bias in HR practices. The source even mentions the ethical need for cultural sensitivity in assessment.
It then dives into a specifically African approach.
Acknowledging the diversity within Africa, but highlighting common themes, often rooted in a worldview emphasizing holism, community, and interconnectedness.
Collectivism is often central. Ubuntu, I am because we are.
Right. Identity is often seen as deeply tied to the community, unlike more individualistic Western views. The source contrasts these community survival versus individual survival, cooperation versus competition.
Personality here is less about a separate self, more about being part of the whole, interacting with the community.
And spirituality, connection to nature, ancestors often play a significant role in understanding well-being and distress.
Criticisms mentioned include concepts being hard to operationalize or measure from a standard scientific view.
Yes, and potential tensions between collective focus and individual expression, though that's complex.
Similar themes emerge in the discussion of Eastern Asian approaches.
Often influenced by philosophies like Hinduism or Buddhism, again, emphasis on interconnectedness, different states of consciousness, sometimes less focus on the individual ego.
Goals might be more about self-realization or enlightenment than personal achievement in the Western sense.
Personality might be viewed more in terms of social roles or spiritual development, again, sometimes seen as subjective, but offering different perspectives on the self and well-being.
And the ecosystemic perspective kind of brings these contextual ideas together.
It does. It's less a specific theory and more a way of thinking, drawing from systems theory. It sees individuals, families, teams, organizations as complex, interconnected systems.
Where you can't understand one part in isolation.
Exactly. Everything affects everything else. A problem in one area might be a symptom of something larger in the system. Context is everything.
So personality itself is seen as a system interacting with its environment.
And in I/O, it's crucial for understanding organizations. You need to see how individual behavior, team dynamics, leadership, structure, culture all interact. Optimizing performance means looking at the whole system, not just isolated parts.
The source also touches on ways of thinking about psychology itself, metapsychology, postmodernism, constructivism.
Metapsychology is basically psychology examining its own assumptions and theories. Theory about theory.
Postmodernism challenges the idea of universal truths, suggesting meaning is often relative to specific groups or contexts.
And constructivism, fitting within that, argues that we actively create our own understanding of reality through our experiences and social interactions.
Social constructivism emphasizes the role of culture and language in shaping that meaning.
Right, so our psychological concepts aren't just objective facts. They're constructed, influenced by our perspectives and contexts.
Which means I/O psychologists need to be really reflective, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Questioning if our tools and theories fit the specific context, being open to adapting them, recognizing the power dynamics involved in how knowledge is created and applied.
So bringing it all together for I/O psychology. It doesn't just pick one framework.
Not at all. It draws on this entire rich, sometimes contradictory history. Structuralism, functionalism, psychoanalysis, behaviorism, humanism, Gestalt, cognitive, biological, positive, trait.
Plus, the crucial overlay of sociocultural, African, Eastern, ecosystemic, and postmodern perspectives.
It's a real mix, and often these different views offer complementary insights, not just conflicting ones.
Contemporary psychology, especially applied fields like IO, tends to be more integrative.
You might use trait tests for selection, trait, behavioral principles for safety training, behaviorism, humanistic ideas for coaching, humanism, systems thinking for organizational change, ecosystemic, all while being mindful of cultural context, sociocultural.
It really shows why sticking to just one view is limiting. You miss too much.
Exactly. The challenge, as the source concludes, is for practitioners to be flexible, reflective, and use the best combination of approaches for the situation at hand in today's complex world of work.
A world that's constantly changing.
And that brings us to a final thought for you to ponder after this deep dive. We've explored so many different ways psychologists have tried to understand human nature, from the hidden unconscious drives to the habits we learn from our environment, the positive potential we strive for, the traits that make us unique, and the profound influence of the cultural and systemic contexts we live in. Given this incredible variety, how do you typically make sense of the people around you? And how do you understand yourself? Do you find one of these perspectives just intuitively resonates with you more, or do you feel yourself naturally shifting between them depending on who you're interacting with or the situation you're in? It's something worth considering as you navigate your own world.